Welcome back to another episode where we explore the darker chapters of human history. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Tonight, we journey back 700 years to a time when justice moved slowly and punishment was designed not just to end life, but to serve as a lesson to all who witnessed it. The stone walls of medieval England absorbed many secrets, but some stories refused to remain silent. In the year 1305, on a warm day in late August, the streets of London filled with crowds who had walked for miles to witness something that would be remembered for centuries. They came not for celebration, but for the final chapter of a story that had begun in the Highlands of Scotland, where mist clings to ancient hills, and the sound of steel on steel had echoed across glen and moor for longer than most could remember. William Wallace had been many things to many people. To some, he was a guardian of Scotland's freedom. To others, he was a rebel who had defied the natural order. But on this day in London, he was simply a man who would face the consequences of choices made years before, in a different country, under different circumstances. The process of medieval justice moved with deliberate slowness. Every step was planned, every moment designed to serve multiple purposes. The authorities understood that punishment was not just about the individual who had broken the law. It was about everyone who watched, everyone who heard the stories later, everyone who might consider similar actions in the future. Wallace had been captured near Glasgow, in a place where he had once felt safe among friends. The word betrayal carries different weights depending on who speaks it. To those who handed him over to English soldiers, it may have meant survival, or gold, or protection for their families. To Wallace, it meant the end of years spent moving through Scottish forests, sleeping in different places each night, trusting fewer and fewer people with each passing season. The journey from Scotland to London took many days. Medieval roads were not designed for comfort, and prisoners were not transported with consideration for their well-being. The cartwheels turned slowly over stones and mud, carrying their cargo southward through countryside that Wallace had never seen and would never see again after this journey. In London, the legal proceedings followed established patterns that had been refined over generations. The concept of trial by peers did not apply to those accused of treason against the crown. The outcome was predetermined by the nature of the charges, but the formalities still mattered. Every word spoken in that courtroom had been chosen carefully by men who understood that they were creating a historical record. The charges read against Wallace included treason, but also murder, sacrilege, and arson. Each accusation represented specific events that had occurred in specific places on specific dates. The burning of buildings in Scottish towns, the deaths of English soldiers and officials, the desecration of religious sites that had been converted to serve English purposes. Wallace listened to these charges without speaking. Medieval courts did not encourage lengthy defences from the accused, particularly in cases of treason. The evidence consisted primarily of witness statements from people who had been present during various battles and raids. Some of these witnesses had travelled hundreds of miles to appear in this London courtroom. The sentence, when it came, followed the established punishment for treason. Drawing, hanging and quartering had become the standard response to those who rebelled against royal authority. The specific details of this punishment had been refined over many years, with each step designed to serve both practical and symbolic purposes. The practical purpose was to ensure death. The symbolic purpose was to demonstrate the power of royal authority over those who challenged it. But there was also a third purpose, less often discussed in official documents but well understood by everyone involved. The prolonged nature of the punishment was intended to create a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The morning of the execution began like many other mornings in medieval London. Vendors prepared their goods for market. Craftsmen opened their workshops. Children woke in homes throughout the city. But by midday, the normal rhythm of daily life had been disrupted by the gathering crowds. The procession from the Tower of London to Smithfield followed a route that had been used for similar purposes many times before. The condemned man was pulled on a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to drag along the ground behind horses. This method of transport served multiple purposes. It prevented the prisoner from walking with dignity to his death. It also ensured that he would arrive at the execution site already weakened and injured. The streets of London were narrow in those days, lined with buildings that leaned close together overhead. The crowd pressed against the walls and filled every available space. People looked down from upper windows. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see over the heads of adults. The noise of the crowd rose and fell in waves. Sometimes individual voices could be heard clearly. Sometimes the sound merged into something that resembled the ocean heard from a great distance. The horses moved steadily forward, their iron shoes ringing against the cobblestones, pulling their burden behind them through the mass of humanity that had gathered to witness this event. At Smithfield, the execution site had been prepared according to procedures that had been followed many times before. The gallows stood ready. The fire had been built nearby, with iron tools arranged within easy reach of the executioner. The crowd formed a rough circle around the area, held back by soldiers who understood the importance of maintaining order during such proceedings. The first part of the punishment was hanging, but not until death. Medieval executioners were skilled in judging exactly how long a person could remain suspended before losing consciousness permanently. The rope was thick hemp, coarse enough to cause immediate pain, but strong enough to support weight without breaking unexpectedly. Wallace was lifted onto the platform. The rope was placed around his neck with practiced efficiency. The crowd grew quieter as this moment approached, not silent, but less chaotic. Conversations continued, but in lower voices. Children asked questions that their parents answered in whispers. The drop was shorter than would be used for a simple execution. The goal was unconsciousness, not immediate death. When the platform fell away, Wallace's body weight created the expected result. His feet kicked against the air for several moments before becoming still. His face changed color as the blood flow to his brain was restricted. The executioner watched carefully, counting moments as he had been trained to do. Too long, and the prisoner would die too soon. Too short, and he would remain conscious for what came next. The timing had to be precise. When the proper moment arrived, Wallace was lowered and the rope removed. He was unconscious, but breathing. His body was placed on a wooden table that had been positioned near the fire for this purpose. The crowd pressed closer, those in front pushed forward by those behind them who wanted to see. The next part of the punishment was disembowelment. This procedure required considerable skill to perform correctly. The goal was to remove the internal organs while keeping the prisoner alive long enough to be aware of what was happening. Medieval knowledge of human anatomy was limited, but sufficient for this purpose. The executioner made the initial incision with a sharp knife, cutting through the skin and muscle of the abdomen in a straight line from the chest to the pelvis. Blood flowed immediately, but not in the massive quantities that would indicate damage to major vessels. The technique had been refined over many years of practice. Wallace regained consciousness as the pain brought him back from the darkness. His eyes opened and focused on the sky above him. The crowd noise seemed to reach him gradually, as if he was surfacing from deep water. His body attempted to move, but restraints held him in place. The executioner worked methodically, removing organs in a specific order that had been established through experience. The stomach came first, then the intestines, each section lifted, carefully to avoid damaging surrounding tissues too quickly. Steam rose from the opened body cavity in the cool air. The removed organs were thrown immediately into the fire that had been prepared nearby. The smell of burning flesh mixed with wood smoke created an odor that would cling to clothing and hair for days afterward. Many in the crowd covered their faces with cloth, but most continued to watch. Wallace remained conscious through much of this procedure. His lips moved, but no sound emerged that could be heard over the noise of the crowd and the crackling of the fire. His eyes tracked movement around him, suggesting that he remained aware of his surroundings. The final part of the punishment was quartering. This involved the removal of limbs and the division of the torso into sections. By this time, blood loss had weakened Wallace considerably, but the executioner continued to work with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the procedure. The arms were removed first, cut at the shoulders with a heavy blade designed for this purpose. Each limb was held up for the crowd to see before being cast into the fire. The legs followed, separated at the hips with the same deliberate efficiency. The torso was then divided into 4 parts, as the name of the punishment suggested. The chest was separated from the abdomen. Each section was displayed to the crowd before joining the limbs in the flames. The head was removed last, held aloft by the hair so that the face could be seen clearly by those gathered to witness the execution. This final act marked the end of William Wallace's life, but it was not the end of the day's events. The head would be placed on a spike at London Bridge, where it would remain visible to all who entered or left the city by that route. The quarters of the body would be sent to different Scottish cities, where they would be displayed as reminders of what happened to those who defied English authority. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming at normal volume. As people processed what they had witnessed, children asked more questions. Adults discussed the details of what they had seen, comparing this execution to others they had witnessed in the past. For many in the crowd, this had been entertainment, a break from the routine of daily life in medieval London. For others, it had been an educational experience, a demonstration of royal power and the consequences of rebellion. For a few, it may have been a source of inspiration, proof that some people would die rather than submit to authority they considered illegitimate. The fire continued to burn long after the crowd had gone home to their evening meals. The executioner and his assistants remained to ensure that the flames consumed everything completely. Medieval authorities understood the importance of preventing the collection of relics that might be used to inspire future rebellions. But the story of William Wallace did not end with his death in Smithfield. Stories have their own life, independent of the people who inspired them. In Scottish villages and towns, people continued to tell tales of the man who had defied Edward Longshanks and died rather than surrender. These stories changed with each telling, as stories do. Details were added, other details were forgotten. The historical Wallace, the man who had lived and breathed and felt pain and fear like any other human being, gradually became something larger and more symbolic. Yet the historical reality remained, recorded in documents that survived in monasteries and royal archives. The facts of medieval justice, the procedures of execution, the politics of rebellion and punishment, these things could be studied and understood by anyone with access to the written records. Medieval England was not unique in its approach to punishment. Throughout Europe, similar procedures were used to deal with those who challenged royal authority. The specific methods varied from place to place, but the underlying principles remained consistent. In France, those convicted of treason might face a similar fate, though the details of execution could differ. The wheel was sometimes used instead of quartering. The condemned person would be tied to a large wooden wheel and beaten with iron bars until their bones were broken, then left to die slowly as the wheel was raised on a pole. In the German states, drawing and quartering was also practiced, but often preceded by other torments. Red-hot pincers might be used to tear flesh from the body before the final dismemberment. The goal was always the same: to create a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed. The Holy Roman Empire had its own variations on these themes. Those convicted of particularly serious crimes might be subjected to breaking on the wheel, a procedure that could last for hours or even days, depending on the skill of the executioner and the desires of the authorities. In all of these places, the procedures were carried out in public, with crowds gathered to witness the events. This was considered an essential part of the punishment. Private executions would have defeated much of the purpose, which was to demonstrate royal power to as many people as possible. The technology of medieval punishment was surprisingly sophisticated. Executioners were skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship. They understood human anatomy well enough to prolong life during torture, and they knew exactly how to use their tools to achieve the desired effects. The tools themselves were designed for specific purposes, different types of knives for different types of cuts, pincers of various sizes for removing different body parts, hammers and clubs calibrated to break bones without causing immediate death. These tools were maintained carefully and passed down from one executioner to another. A dull blade or poorly maintained equipment could ruin an execution, either by causing death too quickly or by creating complications that would interfere with the spectacle. The executioners themselves occupied a strange position in medieval society. They were necessary for the functioning of the justice system, but they were also considered unclean by association with their work. They often lived apart from other people in designated areas outside town walls. Despite this social isolation, executioners were generally well paid for their services. The skills required for their work were specialized and not easily replaced. A competent executioner could command substantial fees, particularly for high-profile cases that drew large crowds. The crowds that gathered for executions represented a cross-section of medieval society. Nobles and commoners, clergy and lay people, adults and children, all came to witness these events. The social mixing that occurred at executions was unusual in a society that was normally stratified along rigid class lines. For many people, public executions were among the few opportunities they had to see members of the nobility close up. The platform and viewing areas were often arranged to provide good sight lines for people of different social ranks, though the best positions were typically reserved for those of higher status. The economic impact of a major execution could be significant for a medieval city. Visitors from surrounding areas would need food, drink, and lodging. Vendors would set up stalls to sell refreshments and souvenirs. Local craftsmen might create commemorative items to mark the occasion. Innkeepers and tavern owners could expect increased business for several days before and after a major execution. Rooms would be rented to visitors who had travelled long distances to witness the event. Extra supplies of food and drink would need to be purchased to meet the increased demand. The planning required for a major execution was extensive. Authorities had to coordinate with local guilds to ensure adequate supplies. Security arrangements had to be made to control the crowds and prevent riots. Medical personnel had to be available in case of injuries in the crowd. The legal procedures leading up to an execution also required careful planning. Documents had to be prepared and copied. Witnesses had to be summoned and their statements recorded. Officials had to coordinate between different jurisdictions to ensure that all proper procedures were followed. In cases involving foreign nationals like William Wallace, diplomatic considerations also came into play. The English authorities had to consider how the execution would be viewed in Scotland and other countries. The goal was to demonstrate power while avoiding actions that might provoke larger conflicts. The religious aspects of medieval execution were also significant. The condemned person was typically offered the opportunity to confess their sins and receive last rites. This was considered important for the salvation of their soul, regardless of the crimes they had committed. Priests and other clergy played important roles in execution proceedings. They would accompany the condemned person to the execution site, offering spiritual comfort and guidance. They would also lead prayers for the crowd and pronounce blessings over the proceedings. The church's position on execution was complex. While church officials generally supported the civil authorities in matters of justice, they also emphasized the importance of mercy and redemption. This sometimes created tension between the desire for spectacular punishment and the Christian emphasis on forgiveness. Medieval chronicles and court records provide detailed accounts of many executions from this period. These documents were carefully maintained because they served as legal precedents for future cases. The specific procedures used in one case would often be cited as justification for similar procedures in later cases. The record-keeping surrounding executions was remarkably thorough. Official documents recorded not only the basic facts of the case, but also details about the methods used, the reactions of the crowd, and the costs involved in carrying out the sentence. These records provide modern historians with detailed information about medieval justice systems and social attitudes. They reveal how punishment was understood and implemented in different times and places, and how these practices evolved over the centuries. The psychological impact of public execution on medieval society is difficult to measure precisely, but contemporary accounts suggest that these events had profound effects on those who witnessed them. Many people reported having nightmares or other lasting psychological effects after attending executions. At the same time, executions were also seen as entertainment, social events that provided opportunities for people to gather and interact outside their normal routines. This dual nature, horrifying yet fascinating, reflects the complex attitudes that medieval people had toward violence and death. The educational function of public execution was explicitly acknowledged by medieval authorities. These events were intended to teach lessons about obedience, authority, and the consequences of rebellion. The graphic nature of the punishment was considered necessary to make these lessons memorable. Children were often brought to executions by their parents, who considered exposure to these events an important part of their education. The sight of extreme punishment was thought to instill respect for authority and discourage future criminal behavior. The technological aspects of medieval execution continued to evolve throughout this period. New methods were developed, existing techniques were refined, and tools were improved to make the procedures more effective or more spectacular. The introduction of gunpowder to Europe eventually led to new forms of execution, though traditional methods like hanging, drawing, and quartering continued to be used for the most serious crimes. The symbolic value of these older methods was considered too important to abandon easily. Regional variations in execution methods reflected local traditions and preferences, but also practical considerations, like the availability of materials and skilled personnel. Some techniques required specialized equipment that might not be available in all locations. The training of executioners was typically handled through informal apprenticeship systems. Young men would work as assistants to experienced executioners, learning the techniques and procedures gradually over several years. The social stigma attached to executioners meant that this profession often ran in families. Sons would follow their fathers into the trade, partly because few other opportunities were available to them, and partly because the necessary skills were more easily learned within the family context. Despite their social isolation, executioners were generally protected by the authorities who employed them. Violence against an executioner could be prosecuted as an attack on royal authority, and the penalties for such crimes were severe. The economic arrangements surrounding execution were complex. While executioners were paid for their services, they also often received additional compensation in the form of property confiscated from the condemned person, or fees collected from spectators who wanted better viewing positions. Some executioners supplemented their income by working as torturers during interrogations, or by providing other services related to criminal justice. The skills required for execution were adaptable to various situations where the application of controlled violence was required. The international aspects of medieval justice become particularly apparent in cases like that of William Wallace. His execution was intended not only to punish him personally, but also to send a message to Scotland and other potential rebels throughout the English territory. The publicity surrounding major executions was carefully managed by medieval authorities. Official accounts were prepared and distributed to ensure that the desired messages reached the intended audiences. These accounts often emphasized the justice of the sentence and the proper conduct of the proceedings. Unofficial accounts also circulated, often containing different details or interpretations of events. These alternative narratives sometimes portrayed the condemned person as a martyr or hero, undermining the official message that the authorities were trying to convey. The control of information about executions was therefore an important concern for medieval governments. Efforts were made to suppress accounts that cast the condemned person in a favorable light, while promoting versions that supported the official interpretation of events. The long-term effects of individual executions on political and social developments are difficult to trace precisely, but some cases clearly had significant historical consequences. The execution of William Wallace, for example, became part of Scottish national mythology and contributed to ongoing resistance to English rule. Similar patterns can be observed in other cases where executions intended to discourage rebellion instead became sources of inspiration for future resistance movements. The authorities' strategy of using spectacular punishment to deter crime sometimes backfired by creating martyrs and symbols. The seasonal timing of executions was often planned to maximize their impact. Spring and summer executions drew larger crowds because travel was easier and people were more willing to spend long hours outdoors. Winter executions might be postponed unless there were compelling reasons to proceed immediately. Weather conditions could significantly affect the execution experience for both the condemned person and the spectators. Rain or snow might reduce the size of the crowd, while unusually hot weather could create dangerous conditions in the closely packed viewing areas. The logistics of crowd control during major executions required careful planning and significant resources. Soldiers and other officials had to be positioned throughout the area to maintain order and prevent riots or rescue attempts. The risk of crowd violence was always present during executions. Sometimes spectators would become unruly and attack officials or each other. In other cases, supporters of the condemned person might attempt to intervene or collect relics from the execution site. The architectural features of execution sites were designed to accommodate large crowds while maintaining security and providing good sightlines. Platforms were built to elevate the proceedings above the crowd level, and barriers were constructed to control access to critical areas. The symbolic geography of execution sites was also important. Many were located outside city walls, in liminal spaces that emphasize the condemned person's exclusion from civilized society. Others were placed in prominent locations to maximize visibility and impact. The preparation of the condemned person for execution involved both practical and ritual elements. Physical preparations might include medical examination to ensure that the person was healthy enough to survive the early stages of the punishment. Ritual preparations often involved religious ceremonies, confession, and the opportunity to make final statements or requests. These procedures served multiple purposes, including the spiritual welfare of the condemned person and the reinforcement of social and religious value. The role of confession in medieval execution was particularly significant. The condemned person's willingness to acknowledge their crimes and express repentance was seen as important for their spiritual salvation and for the moral authority of the justice system. Some condemned persons refused to confess or express repentance, creating complications for the authorities. These cases were handled differently, depending on the specific circumstances and the broader political context of the execution. The final statements made by condemned persons at execution sites were carefully recorded and widely circulated. These statements were often used by both supporters and opponents of the condemned person to advance their own political or religious agendas. The immediate aftermath of an execution involved several practical tasks. The site had to be cleared and cleaned. The remains had to be disposed of according to the sentence and local customs. Officials had to file reports and settle accounts related to the event. The longer-term consequences of executions were often difficult to predict or control. While the immediate goal was deterrence and demonstration of authority, the actual effects on public opinion and political developments could be quite different from what was intended. The documentation of medieval executions provides valuable insights into the values, beliefs, and practices of the societies that carried them out. These records reveal not only the mechanics of punishment, but also the broader cultural context in which these events took place. The study of medieval execution practices has evolved significantly over time as historians have gained access to new sources and developed new analytical frameworks. Early accounts often focused on the sensational aspects of these events, while more recent scholarship has emphasized their social and political function. The preservation of execution records has been uneven, with some cases documented in great detail while others have left little trace in the historical record. This uneven preservation affects our understanding of how common different practices were and how they varied across time and place. The interpretation of medieval execution records requires careful attention to the biases and limitations of the sources. Official accounts often emphasize the justice and necessity of the punishment, while alternative sources might present very different perspectives on the same events. Modern readers of medieval execution accounts often struggle with the apparent cruelty and brutality of these practices. It's important to remember that these events took place in societies with very different values and beliefs about justice, authority, and human nature. The legacy of medieval execution practices can be traced through subsequent centuries as legal systems evolved and social attitudes changed. Many elements of medieval justice persisted well into the modern era, while others were gradually abandoned or transformed. The comparative study of execution practices across different medieval societies reveals both similarities and important differences in how these procedures were understood and implemented. These variations reflect broader differences in legal traditions, political structures, and cultural value. The role of gender in medieval execution was complex, with different procedures sometimes used for male and female condemned persons. These differences reflected contemporary beliefs about gender roles and the appropriate treatment of women in the justice system. The treatment of different social classes during execution also varied significantly. Nobles might receive different punishments than commoners, or the same punishments might be carried out in different ways depending on the social status of the condemned person. Religious minorities often faced particular challenges in medieval justice systems, and their executions might involve additional elements related to their religious beliefs or practices. These cases reveal the intersection of religious persecution and criminal justice in medieval society. The economic costs of medieval execution were substantial, including not only the direct expenses of carrying out the sentence, but also the broader economic impacts on the community. These costs had to be balanced against the perceived benefits of public punishment. The international diplomatic consequences of high-profile executions were sometimes significant, particularly when the condemned person was a foreign national, or when the case involved cross-border political conflicts. The technological limitations of medieval society affected how executions were carried out and documented. The absence of modern medical knowledge, communication systems, and recording technologies shaped every aspect of these proceedings. The psychological aspects of medieval execution extended beyond the immediate participants to include the broader community. These events affected how people thought about crime, punishment, authority, and their own place in society. The educational aspects of public execution were explicitly recognized by medieval authorities, who saw these events as opportunities to reinforce social values and deter future criminal behavior through spectacular demonstration of the consequences of wrongdoing. As night falls over the ancient stones of England, the stories of medieval justice continue to echo through time. The procedures, the crowds, the careful documentation, All of these elements combined to create a system of punishment that served multiple purposes for the societies that implemented it. The historical William Wallace, the man who died in Smithfield on that August day in 1305, became part of a larger story about resistance, authority, and the price of defying established power. His execution was intended to end that story, but instead it became another chapter in a narrative that would continue for centuries. The medieval world was a place where justice moved slowly and punishment was designed to be remembered. The techniques developed during this period reflected the values and beliefs of societies that understood power differently than we do today. The records they left behind provide us with detailed glimpses into how these systems worked and what they meant to the people who lived within them. These stories from 700 years ago remind us that the past was inhabited by real people who faced real consequences for their choices. But Wallace was just one name in a much longer list. And what happened to some of the others? Well, that's where things get truly disturbing. Joan of Arc faced flames in Rouen in 1431. But here's what most people don't know. The English authorities were terrified she might escape, so they built something special for her execution. A platform 10 feet high, surrounded by water-filled moats. No rescue was possible. No last-minute intervention could save her. The 19-year-old girl who had convinced the Dauphin of France that God spoke through her was about to discover what human beings do to those they fear most. The charges against her included witchcraft, heresy, and wearing men's clothing. But the real crime was simpler. She had made the English look weak. Joan's trial lasted 4 months. 4 months of interrogation by theologians from the University of Paris. Men who had spent their lives studying scripture, now using their knowledge to find legal justification for burning a teenage peasant girl alive. The questions they asked her reveal the medieval mind in all its complexity. Did she hear voices? Yes. Did these voices come from God or the devil? From God, she insisted. Could she prove this? How does one prove the source of divine revelation? But I'll tell you something even more chilling. The records show that Joan recanted. On May 24, 1431, faced with immediate execution, she signed a document admitting her errors. She agreed to wear women's clothing. She accepted life imprisonment instead of death. For 3 days, she lived in a cell, wearing the dress they had given her. 3 days of safety. Then something changed. The guards found her back in men's clothing. When questioned, she said the voices had returned. St. Michael, St. Margaret, St. Catherine. They told her the recantation was wrong. Whether she truly heard these voices again, or whether she simply decided that life imprisonment was worse than death, we'll never know. But the result was inevitable. The relapsed heretic would burn. The execution site at Rouen old marketplace had been prepared with unusual care. Typically, condemned witches were strangled before the flames reached them, a small mercy. But Joan's platform was built too high for the executioner to reach her with his rope. The English wanted her to burn alive, conscious for all to see. The wood was green, deliberately chosen because it burns slower, with more smoke. The flames would take their time reaching her. The smoke would make breathing difficult long before the fire touched her skin. Medieval executioners understood these details perfectly. Joan asked for a cross. A sympathetic English soldier made one from 2 pieces of wood, which she clutched as the flames rose around her. A Dominican friar held up a crucifix so she could see it above the smoke. Her last word, witnesses reported, was Jesus, spoken 6 times as the fire consumed her. But here's what happened next that will make your skin crawl. The English weren't finished. They raked apart the coals and ashes, displaying Joan's charred remains to the crowd to prove she was truly dead. Then they burned everything again, reducing her to ash. Finally, they threw these ashes into the Seine River, ensuring no relics could be collected by her followers. 25 years later, the French would declare Joan innocent and the trial invalid. But by then, the ashes had long since dissolved in the river waters. The girl who saved France had become part of the landscape she died defending. Now let me tell you about Edmund Campion and why his execution in 1581 was different from anything that came before. Campion was a Jesuit priest during the reign of Elizabeth I, when being Catholic in England could cost you everything. The rack was already 300 years old when they used it on Campion. But what they did to him was methodical in a way that earlier tortures were not. The Tower of London's lieutenant, a man named Owen, had refined the process into something resembling science. Campion was stretched on the rack 3 times before his trial. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate sessions, each carefully calculated to cause maximum pain without killing him. The joints of his shoulders and hips were deliberately dislocated. His arms and legs were pulled until the ligaments tore. After the first session, Campion couldn't use his hands to feed himself. After the second, he couldn't walk without assistance. After the third, he had to be carried to his trial. But his mind remained clear, and that's what terrified Elizabeth's government most. You see, Campion wasn't just any priest. He was brilliant, Oxford scholar, renowned debater, author of works that were circulating throughout Catholic Europe. When he spoke at his trial, even his Protestant judges admitted his eloquence was remarkable. The charge was treason, not heresy. Elizabeth's government had learned from previous reigns that burning people for their religious beliefs made martyrs and turned public opinion against the crown. So Catholic priests were charged with plotting against the Queen, whether they had done so or not. Campion's execution at Tyburn followed the traditional pattern for traitors: hanging, drawing, and quartering. But with one crucial difference: the crowd was smaller, more carefully controlled. Elizabeth's government had learned that public executions could backfire if the condemned person was too sympathetic. When Campion was hanged, the executioner waited until he was fully unconscious before cutting him down. This was actually a mercy, though one the authorities would deny if asked. The disembowelment and quartering were performed on his unconscious body. His head was displayed on London Bridge as tradition demanded. But something unprecedented happened next. Catholic sympathizers began making pilgrimages to see it. People knelt and prayed beneath the spike where Campion's head was mounted. Guards had to be posted to prevent the collection of relics. Within 20 years, Campion's execution had inspired more young men to become priests than his preaching ever had. The very thing Elizabeth's government tried to prevent, martyrdom, had been achieved through the attempt to avoid it. But now, I need to tell you about something that makes all these other executions look almost merciful by comparison. The execution of the regicides in 1660, the men who signed King Charles I's death warrant. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, he faced a problem. 59 men had signed his father's death warrant. Some had fled the country. Some had died of natural causes. But 10 were still alive and within reach of royal justice. The king wanted revenge, but he also wanted to send a message that would echo through history. These men had committed the ultimate crime, killing a king appointed by God. Their punishment needed to be unprecedented in its severity. The execution of Colonel Thomas Harrison on October 13, 1660, established the template for what followed. Harrison had been one of the most vocal supporters of the king's execution. Now he would discover what happened to those who kill kings. Harrison was hanged at Charing Cross, but only until he lost consciousness. Then he was cut down and placed on a wooden table. The executioner revived him with smelling salts. They wanted him awake for what came next. The disembowelment began while Harrison was fully conscious. The executioner made a precise cut from his chest to his pelvis, then reached inside and began removing organs. Harrison's eyes remained open throughout the procedure. Witnesses reported that he tried to speak, though no words were audible. But here's the part that even the crowd found disturbing. When the executioner pulled out Harrison's heart and held it up, shouting the traditional words, "Behold the heart of a traitor," Harrison's head turned and his eyes focused on his own heart. Medical knowledge in 1660 was limited, but the executioner knew enough anatomy to keep Harrison alive for nearly 10 minutes after the disembowelment began. 10 minutes of consciousness while watching his own organs being removed and thrown into the fire. The quartering followed the established pattern, but with one addition. The parts of Harrison's body were not thrown into the fire immediately. Instead, they were displayed on tables around the execution site, arranged so that the crowd could see every detail of what remained. This wasn't just execution. It was theatre designed to terrorize, and it worked. When the next regicide, John Carew, was brought to his execution a few days later, witnesses reported that he was so terrified he could barely stand. But the authorities made a mistake with Carew's execution. They allowed too much time for him to speak to the crowd. Carew used those final moments to deliver a speech that turned the crowd's mood completely around. He spoke about tyranny, about the rights of Parliament, about the difference between killing a king and killing a tyrant. By the time he finished, sections of the crowd were cheering for him instead of jeering. The government's attempt at psychological warfare had backfired. From that point on, The regicides were gagged before their executions. No more speeches, no more opportunities to win sympathy from the crowd, just silent suffering designed to intimidate anyone else who might consider rebellion. But let me tell you about a different kind of medieval punishment that most people have never heard of. The execution of Robert-François Damiens in 1757 for attempting to assassinate King Louis XV of France. Damiens had approached the king with a small knife, inflicting what amounted to a scratch on his arm, but attempting to kill a king, even unsuccessfully, was the highest form of treason. The French authorities decided to make an example that would be remembered for centuries. The sentence was death by dismemberment using horses, but not immediately. First, Damiens would be tortured to force him to reveal his accomplices. The assumption was that no one would attempt regicide alone. There had to be a conspiracy. The torture began with the brodequins, wooden wedges driven between planks that compressed the legs. Each blow of the hammer drove the wedges deeper, crushing bones and muscles slowly and methodically. Damiens screamed but revealed no accomplices because there were none to reveal. Next came the estrapade. His arms were tied behind his back, and he was lifted by a rope attached to his wrists. His own body weight dislocated his shoulders. Then he was dropped suddenly, tearing the ligaments even further. For 2 hours, French interrogators used every technique they knew, but Damiens insisted he had acted alone, driven by personal grievances against the king's policies. The interrogators couldn't accept this. Surely someone else was involved. Finally, they moved to the execution itself. Damiens was taken to the Place de Grève in Paris, where a scaffold had been built for his death. But this wasn't going to be a quick hanging. The French had planned something much more elaborate. First, the hand that had held the knife was burned off with sulfur. The executioner used red-hot pincers to remove pieces of flesh from Damiens' chest, arms and legs. Molten lead, boiling oil, and burning resin were poured into these wounds. Damiens remained conscious throughout this preliminary torture. French executioners were skilled at keeping their subjects alive through procedures that should have killed them. They understood exactly how much pain a human body could endure without shutting down. Then came the dismemberment. 4 horses were attached to Damiens' arms and legs with ropes. The idea was simple. The horses would pull in different directions until his body was torn apart. But human joints are stronger than people realize. For over an hour, the horses pulled without success. Damiens' body stretched, his joints dislocated, but his limbs remained attached. The crowd grew restless. This wasn't the quick spectacle they had expected. The executioner had to use axes to weaken the joints at the shoulders and hips. Only then were the horses able to complete their work. Damiens remained conscious until the moment his torso was separated from his limbs. His head was then placed on a spike and displayed at the city gates. But the French authorities made the same mistake the English had made with other executions. They created a martyr instead of a deterrent. Pamphlets describing Damiens' execution circulated throughout Europe. Instead of demonstrating the power of royal authority, the excessive brutality of his death became evidence of royal tyranny. The French monarchy's reputation never recovered from the publicity surrounding this execution. But the most disturbing aspect of medieval justice wasn't the executions themselves. It was how ordinary people reacted. The crowds that gathered weren't just passive observers. They were active participants in a social ritual that reinforced the power structures of their society. Children were brought to executions as part of their education. Parents wanted their offspring to understand the consequences of disobedience and the power of legitimate authority. Entire families would travel for miles to witness major executions. The execution of Charles I himself in 1649 drew a crowd estimated at over 100,000 people. London's normal population was only about 400,000, which means that 1 in 4 residents of the city was present to watch their king die. When the executioner held up Charles's severed head, the crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some cheered, some wept, some stood in stunned silence. But everyone understood they were witnessing the end of one world and the beginning of another. The execution block used for Charles I still exists today, preserved in the Tower of London. Visitors can see the indentations made by the king's head and the executioner's axe, physical evidence of the moment when divine right monarchy ended in England. But here's something that will give you chills. The executioner who killed Charles I was never identified. He wore a mask and spoke in a disguised voice. To this day, historians debate who actually performed the execution. The man who killed a king disappeared into history, his identity protected by those who feared royalist revenge. The scaffold where Charles died was dismantled immediately after the execution. Every piece of wood was burned to prevent the collection of relics, but people still came to the site, kneeling where the scaffold had stood, praying for the dead king's soul. Within 12 years, Charles II had been restored to the throne. The men who executed his father faced the same brutal punishments they had inflicted on others. The wheel of medieval justice turned slowly, but it always turned. Now let me tell you about the execution methods that were considered too cruel, even by medieval standards. Yes, such things existed. Even societies that accepted drawing and quartering as normal had limits on what they considered acceptable. Flaying, removing someone's skin while they were still alive, was practiced in some parts of Europe, but most authorities considered it excessive. The process was too slow, too likely to cause death before the spectacle was complete, and too disturbing even for crowds accustomed to public execution. Sawing, cutting someone in half with a large saw, was sometimes used for specific crimes, but authorities found it difficult to control. The condemned person usually died too quickly from blood loss, defeating the purpose of prolonged punishment. The brazen bull, a bronze sculpture of a bull with a hollow interior where victims were roasted alive, was known throughout medieval Europe, but rarely used. The equipment was expensive, the procedure was difficult to manage, and the symbolism was considered too pagan for Christian societies. These methods were rejected, not because medieval people were squeamish about cruelty, but because they didn't serve the practical purposes that executions were supposed to accomplish. Effective public punishment needed to be dramatic but controlled, shocking but comprehensible. The most successful execution methods struck a balance between spectacle and meaning. They needed to be severe enough to deter crime, visible enough to demonstrate authority, and structured enough to reinforce social values. This is why hanging, drawing, and quartering became the standard punishment for treason throughout much of Europe. It was dramatic, it could be performed publicly, it sent clear messages about the consequences of rebellion, and it could be carried out with readily available equipment and skill. But the psychological impact of these executions extended far beyond the immediate participants. Entire communities were shaped by the knowledge that such punishments were possible. The threat of extreme execution influenced behavior even among people who would never commit serious crimes. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of people who changed their plans, abandoned conspiracies, or fled the country rather than risk the possibility of facing drawing and quartering. The deterrent effect of these punishments was measured not just in crimes prevented, but in thoughts never acted upon. The documentation of medieval executions was itself a form of punishment. Official accounts were copied and distributed throughout the realm, ensuring that news of each execution reached communities that couldn't attend in person. The written word carried the terror beyond the physical boundaries of the execution site. And here's something that will make you think differently about medieval society. These execution accounts were among the most popular forms of literature in their time. People bought, read, and shared pamphlets describing famous executions with the same enthusiasm that modern audiences consume crime documentary. The appetite for these stories reveals something fundamental about human nature that hasn't changed in 700 years. We are fascinated by extreme experiences, drawn to stories of people facing the ultimate consequences of their choices, compelled by the intersection of individual will and social power. As we reach the end of our journey through the darker corridors of medieval justice, remember that these were not abstract historical events. They were lived experiences of real human beings who felt pain, fear, hope, and despair just as intensely as we do today. The stone walls that witnessed these events still stand in many places. The Tower of London, where so many met their end. The castles and town squares where justice was dispensed with axe and rope and fire. These places remember, even if we choose to forget. The techniques may have changed, but the fundamental questions remain the same. How should society respond to those who break its most sacred laws? What balance should be struck between justice and mercy, between punishment and redemption, between the needs of the community and the rights of the individual? Medieval Europe answered these questions in ways that seem barbaric to us now, but they were answers nonetheless, products of societies that believed deeply in the importance of order, hierarchy, and divine authority. Their methods were brutal, but their conviction was absolute. The men and women who died on medieval scaffolds, who faced the executioner's tools with whatever courage they could muster, who spoke their final words to crowds that had come to watch them suffer. They were participants in a drama that defined their world as surely as our legal systems define ours. Their stories survive in chronicles and court records, in ballads and folk tales, in the collective memory of communities that witnessed their deaths. They remind us that history is made by individuals making choices, facing consequences, and discovering what they are truly willing to die for. The medieval world believed that some crimes deserved punishment so severe they would echo through eternity. Whether they were right or wrong, their executions certainly achieved a kind of immortality. 700 years later, we still tell their stories, still try to understand what drove them to their fates, still wonder what we would have done in their place. And in that wondering, in that attempt to understand lives so different from our own, yet so recognizably human, we discover something important about ourselves and the societies we have built on the foundations they laid so long ago.